good afternoon again, and thank you for joining us. Lunch will be arriving shortly, so enjoy that. I'm Nancy Kirkpatrick. I'm the Executive Director and CEO of OhioNet, and I am joined today by Gwen Evans, Vice President of Global Library Relations at Elsevier, and Eileen Tatum, Narrative Design Manager at Shadow Health. You can talk to us here or find us all on LinkedIn if you want more details about our professional backgrounds. So, we are here today to talk about what goes into the process of fostering inclusion in content, data, and services from a variety of perspectives. I'll talk about how our organization and our memberships are tackling this challenge in services and our organizational structure. Gwen will discuss the decision-making process and implications for developing gender, race, and ethnicity identity metadata and editorial workflow systems and bibliometrics-based analyses to produce actionable insights. Did I get that right? Okay. Or something like that. And Eileen will share best practices for representing LGBTQIA plus people in educational and training content in healthcare settings and possibly beyond. We really hope that today's conversation will inspire you to think creatively about how to begin to foster inclusion in meaningful ways in your libraries and organizations. So with that, let me share a couple of ways that OhioNet is trying to build inclusion into our systems, our organization, and the larger Ohio library community. If you aren't familiar, OhioNet is a multi-type library consortium that serves academic, public, K-12, and special libraries throughout the state in a variety of ways. And this includes things like negotiating discounts on group purchasing of electronic resources. We provide a lot of training and professional development opportunities, and we offer consulting services as well. And then one of the biggest things that we do is to provide technical services and supports to several subgroups of membership. So there are two public library consortia and one academic library consortium within OhioNet membership that we support. And one of those is called OPAL, which is which stands for Ohio Private Academic Libraries. There are 27 members in that group, and they vary from little teeny tiny theological libraries with 1 FTE to a 3,000 FTE serving library that might have 4 or 5 staff. And so OPAL was recently part of a larger statewide discussion about language and control vocabulary and cataloging practices. This discussion is not a new one, and it might be happening on your campuses as well, or your libraries and institutions. And part of this was spurred by the 2019 documentary Change the Subject, produced by students at Dartmouth College who questioned anti-immigrant language in the Library of Congress subject headings. If you haven't seen the documentary, I highly recommend it. It's just under an hour long, and it really succinctly captures not only what is at stake and why words matter, but it also demonstrates how, unfortunately, politicized this conversation can be and why we need to keep fighting for those changes. So jumping back to OPAL, they are also part of a larger resource sharing system called Ohiolink, which I'm sure you've all heard of. And Ohiolink facilitated this really great discussion and ultimately addressed the cataloging issue in their system by implementing a solution where the preferred term and the outdated term kind of coexist alongside each other in the bibliographic record, but they still prefer to use the preferred term. So OPAL, they decided they wanted to take that one step further. And so they completely eradicated the offensive and outdated subject headings from their catalog. And specifically, our Director of Technology Services, Matt Polson, shared this sort of explanation with me about why they did that. And he says, "We felt that it was important to do this despite the significant effort required and potential for disruption to existing processes. Specifically, updates from our outsourced authority control service and other ongoing automated batch loads held the potential to undo any local deviation from LC forms of entry. Fortunately, we were able to make adjustments to Sierra and the processes and scripts that support the ongoing record loading. Those changes allowed us to eliminate the terms completely and to assure those changes wouldn't be undone inadvertently by future loads." So their cataloging COI found a way for our local OPAL system to eradicate those terms completely. And we've had students provide feedback that it actually makes a difference. So it's meaningful work, and these things do matter. So there's that. My second example of ways that we're addressing this at OhioNet is taking place within our organization itself. So the murder of George Floyd and the subsequent civil unrest that forced a deeper examination of corporate organizations and societal structures broadly, also really forced me to look at our organization with a new lens. OhioNet is a 44-year-old institution whose staff size has ranged anywhere from 12 to 20, so we're not very big. And the past two leaders, myself and my predecessor, are both African American. However, having Black leadership doesn't automatically mean our organization is anti-racist, and it's important to me, to our team, and to our board to make sure that we become so. And as you probably do know, Black leadership also doesn't mean we automatically know how to tackle this problem, because all Black people are not de facto DEI experts. And frankly, that probably bears repeating. All people of color are not, in fact, DEI experts. If you remember nothing else from today, please remember that. So we chose to contract with an outside organization, the Diversity Center of Northeast Ohio, to lead a year-long series of workshops with the team at OhioNet. So they started with us, they started with some facilitated conversations, and the first couple of topics that we tackled were really light. It was bias and micromessages, and then we moved on to examining privilege and systemic inequities, and we ended that first series with a presentation, and it wasn't just a presentation, it was a whole workshop, on equity, justice, and critical assessment. So the work there, again, very meaningful, all the staff is cooperating, it's been welcomed in a way that I frankly didn't anticipate, so it's been really good. And then beginning in January, we are working through their anti-racist organizational toolkit, which should support our ability to integrate an approach of racial equity and inclusion in our organization. One of the biggest benefits to me of hiring somebody from outside is that I didn't have to lead the work, because while I am a Black woman, I am not a DEI expert. So it is really nice to have somebody from the outside come in and approach this with us, so that I can be a participant in the conversation along with the rest of the team and not have to lead all of the things. So if your organization is struggling to determine how to respond to the call to build inclusion, I would strongly encourage you to research organizations on your campus or in your area who are already skilled in this, and contract with them for this work. And on that note, this work is not free. If you don't have the budget for this, then I might suggest it's time to re-examine your organizational priorities and find out where you can find the money for this work. We have too long relied on unpaid labor of our historically excluded colleagues, and it's time that we stop. The racial reconciliation that we need in our field, frankly, and in our society, at large will cost us something, and I would love to see libraries lead the way to demonstrate that that cost is spread equally among everyone and not the same groups that have been paying those costs for a very long time. So, the last thing I want to touch on is a project we're working on that's still in the discovery phase. So during the last year, one of our board members came to me and said, I want us to start some sort of BIPOC post-baccalaureate program where we basically pay tuition, professional development expenses, et cetera, for a historically excluded person to go through grad school, get their library degree, and then come out on the other end like free of student loan debt. And then the conversation with the board expanded that to, well, it shouldn't just be tuition, it should cover other educational expenses. We need to cover their cost to go to ALA. We need to make them an OhioNet employee so they have, health insurance and things while they're going through it. And because OhioNet is such a large organization and has such a large membership, we need to provide training opportunities at every library type, every organization that we have, so that they really come out with knowing what it is that they want to do and having experience doing it. And then they'll have, in theory, have a leg up on their career when they get out. So it was a really good conversation, which also made us realize that we didn't really know what we were getting into. So it was like we had this really great aspiration, like we want to create this thing. And then, I raised my hand and said, well, if we just have one, then that person is good. Like, who are they going to get support from? Like, we need a cohort. And then the conversation became, okay, how do we get other organizations to sponsor so we can develop the systems that we need? So we took a step back and realized that instead of creating this program tomorrow, which some of us really wanted to do, we really needed to start by creating a part-time position for a BIPOC researcher to help us develop the program. So that's where we're at. So currently, and watch our job postings in case you have friends that may want to apply, but in the next, I'm going to say 3 months, we will have a job posting for a part-time researcher that can help us look at this thoughtfully and look at best practices, examine what has worked and what hasn't in library residency programs that already exist, and in other residency programs outside the library that exist. And we also want somebody who can do some primary research in the state of Ohio so that we're not just relying on other people's data. And in that way, we hope to do this in a much more mindful way. So our board is absolutely still committed to funding and launching this initiative, but we are also as committed to doing it in a thoughtful and inclusive manner that doesn't inadvertently create more harm than we meant to, and stress for the participants. So our goal is to get that hopefully. Again, we'll hire somebody in the next 3 months, hopefully sometime next year in 2022, we'll have some of the data that we need to actually fund it and get it going. And then I really frankly applaud our board for understanding that the financial commitment may be significant, but it's one that they want to make in our profession. So those are 3 of the things that are happening in Ohio, and that's it for me. I'm going to turn it over to Gwen.
Thank you, Nancy. I'm still in Ohio, and Ohio is the best.
What if I am if I'm muted? How about that? This is good. Sorry. This isn't, yes. Yeah. Okay, so you can all. Okay. You can all hear me now? All right, I'll get started. I'm Gwen Evans, and I'm just going to jump right in. Everyone in the scholarly communication research ecosystem shares the responsibility to accelerate equity within our various sectors. So this is a really brief look at Elsevier's efforts to promote gender I&D using a data-informed, evidence-based approach, as well as the beginnings of that effort to address similar equity issues with race and ethnicity. And I'm going to talk about Elsevier, but I just want to emphasize how collaborative this effort is with funders, with individual researchers, with research organizations. We are not going alone here. The charge to address this at Elsevier came directly from the CEO and Elsevier's external I&D advisory board. We also have an internal gender equity task force, and between them, they are charged to address, in collaboration with funders, research organizations, and higher education institutions, other publishers and individual researchers, driving gender and racial and ethnic equity across the STEM academic career path, promoting diversity and inclusion, as well as geographic representation in the publishing ecosystem. Sorry, I'm having trouble scrolling. Okay, I'm a Mac user. This is so this includes editorial boards, peer review, scientific conferences, and supporting publication and inclusive participation in research as it is done. Uncovering and addressing issues of inequalities and implicit bias in publication workflows, supporting enhanced sex and gender-based analysis in research, and disseminating such analyses in research reports, which we then turn out. I don't know why it's doing this. So anyway, this is as you can tell, this is a really broad and collaborative effort to do this. It just is not advanced. That's it. Okay. So the analytics report, since 2015, we've produced a number of analytic research reports on gender. All of them draw on the collection of a rich collection of data sources, notably Scopus data, and are designed to answer the call for a data-driven approach for addressing gender inequality issues and serve as vehicles for understanding the role gender plays within the global research enterprise, specifically with regards to the research workforce. So these are just a few slides of data from the most recent gender report, which is the Researcher Journey Through a Gender Lens, which came out in 2020. So this chart shows the median value for the ratio of women to men among all authors in 15 countries in the report. We looked at 2 time periods. Authors who were actively publishing during the period 1999 to 2003, that's the square at the bottom of those vertical lines, and compared that to authors who were actively publishing during the period 2014 to 2018, and that is the circle. The black line in the middle, that 100 line, that is gender parity, that is an equal number of women and men. If the symbol is above the line in the green zone, the ratio is more women. Below in the blue zone, the ratio is more men. So you can see the trend is more gender parity over time. And the US is the chartreuse line, and you can see that we do not perform as well as the EU and some of other North American countries. The standout stars are Argentina and Portugal. And I just want to mention, we just did a deep dive with data with the government of Portugal, which again is on the website. And the interesting thing about Portugal is some of their success has to do with national level policies designed to support women researchers. Okay, all right. Again, some other data points from the report. Women are least represented in the physical sciences. The physical sciences has had the slowest growth in participation. Women are highly represented in earlier career cohorts, but they're least represented as last authors in the STEM environment, which is, sort of lead authors. Men and women tend to collaborate more with their own gender. So again, that report is a really rich source of data if you want to take a look at that. And now I'm going to move on to the next step of using that sort of data-driven for actionable insights. So given these contexts, we are implementing our motto, have data, use data, in support of expanding gender and racial and ethnic diversity across our journal's editorial, reviewer, and author population. And that's through the analysis of self-reported user data in our systems, notably our editorial management system. We're a leader in this space, and we hope we can serve as a model for other stakeholders in the research ecosystem. So this is a screenshot of our new gender identity question and the options within the editorial management system. And editors, peer reviewers, and authors are presented with this. The schema has been approved by our external IND advisory board, but as Nancy alluded to, this is not the last time we will update the schema. We know that this is a work in progress. We know that we don't want to let the perfect be the enemy of the good, and we're closely following the National Academy of Science, Engineering, and Medical initiative that's sponsored by the NIH called Measuring Sex, Gender Identity, and Sexual Orientation. There's a 5-page document that explains how we got here. As you can imagine, there's a lot of complexity to support data privacy, including firewalls between our internal HR system and externally facing roles. So on this page, There's an explanation with a link to the data privacy policy. There's the questions, and they must include, any of these questions must include prefer not to disclose. We worked with our external consultant and our IND board to get the correct terminology, and we don't request data that we do not need. So again, recognizing this is not perfect, we didn't want to let that prevent us from moving forward with important work related to advancing gender diversity, which includes having quantifiable information regarding gender. And again, these will be constantly reviewed as the context that we all work in changes in. And because this is a global effort, laws and regulations across countries and regions differ, but we have determined that legally we can ask these questions as long as it's self-identifying and again offering options not to disclose. GDPR came out in the middle of this process, so they already had to go to a major revision. And to Nancy's point, this was not, they did not rush into this. It was a slow process. So this is one response from a reviewer on Twitter. And Jamie Lundeen of University of Ottawa says, data collection is a necessary, if insufficient, first step to understanding and addressing inequities. So where does this data end up? On 600 of our journal titles, if you go to the journal homepage, you will see the gender diversity indicator. It went live in February 2021, and it publicly displays the gender distribution of the editors for 600 of our titles. So it's public information, and you'll notice that this is the Journal of Surgical Research, which for the journal has a higher proportion of women editors than the neuroscience journal portfolio at Elsevier. So there's a benchmark there. So the journal editorial staff are 46% women, 54% man, 0 non-binary or gender diverse, and 0% prefer not to disclose. But you see across the neuroscience portfolio, only 30% of the editors are women. So that's what we mean by benchmarking and using some quantitative data to let an individual journal see how they're doing against the entire portfolio and take some action. So a librarian at the Francis Crick Institute in the UK asked on Twitter, well, this is really interesting, a good first step. I wonder when they'll tackle other diversity dimensions, and the answer is we are already. Again, this is a multi-publisher initiative led by the Royal Society of Chemistry. It's race and ethnicity data is, for many reasons, is much more complex challenge because a lot of this, the metadata or a lot of the categories have to do with national census data, and of course what happens in the UK is different from what happens in the US. So there's that lack of universality for a global application. There's increased hesitancy, as you might imagine, when asked to answer multiple personal data questions, and there is great sensitivity to this demographic data compared with gender identity. So we're hoping to we're taking the learnings from the process of doing gender diversity data and applying it to this effort. So we're working through the complexity together. As I mentioned, Royal Society of Chemistry is part of the Joint Commitment for Action on Inclusion and Diversity in Publishing. We have an external subject matter consultant, Professor Anne Morning, who's a researcher at NYU. This is for research subject matter. We're doing global testing with a lot of usability considerations, and there's a planned engagement with a global group of national partners. So that's where it is now. The first step to go back to the gender equity data, you'll start seeing peer review data, and then anonymized aggregate data. None of this will be provides an individual anonymized aggregate data, and the additional resources, we all upload these. I don't know where we upload these. To Capital? Do we get to upload to Capital? Okay, or we will send this deck out to you. You can see more information here, and that is the end of mine. Thank you. And also, if you're interested in a much deeper dive into this initiative, my colleague Paul Krasinski is the co-chair of the Gender Task Force. And if you get a group of libraries together, we would be happy to do this and explain in more detail about the data and the efforts and the underlying methodology. Thank you very much. Now, Eileen.
How are y'all doing? Is the food good? Yeah, all right. So I'm Eileen Tatum, and I'm the manager for the narrative design team on Shadow Health here at Elsevier. So I am really excited to get to talk to you today about our LGBT plus character development processes and principles at Shadow Health. And it's going to be interesting. Also, I used to live here 10 years ago. I was in American Vista, serving in North Charleston. And if anyone works for the Charleston Public Library System, and I can speak to them about my overdue fees from 10 years ago, I'm open to settling up, and we can figure something out. So chances are you've probably never heard of narrative design or a narrative designer. So on the narrative design team, we believe in the transformative power of storytelling as an educational tool. We're responsible on a very base level for the written and the audible content in the simulations that Shadow Health makes. We also collaborate with other teams to design a narrative flow of an assignment, to create learning activities, and to design user experiences that interact with our patented conversation engine. So think of narrative design as kind of a blended role between UX design, learning and instructional design, and direct content production. We blend story, empathy-grounded, and trauma-informed educational principles, and our cutting-edge technology to teach graduate and undergraduate nurses how to communicate clearly, effectively, how to perform thorough assessments, and how to identify opportunities for education and for empathy with their patients. So why does having LGBT plus characters in simulations for nurses matter? Nurses and healthcare providers often lack the proper education to adequately provide safe and competent care to the LGBT plus community. And although nurses are the largest segment of healthcare providers in the United States, on average they only receive 2 hours of education related to LGBT plus focused content. 2 hours in their whole educational course as either undergraduate or graduate nurses. We also know that transgender and gender diverse, or TDD people, experience significant health disparities related to discrimination and limited access to appropriate care. Nearly 25% of transgender or gender diverse people report delaying healthcare seeking over the past year due to a fear of mistreatment in a healthcare setting. And a third report having had at least one negative experience with a healthcare provider in the last year. We can definitely do better than that. So our simulations provide the opportunity for our learners to engage with people from marginalized or underrepresented communities. They may be meeting people in our simulations that they have never met in real life. Practice conversations with LGBT plus populations, which include realistic moments for educating or empathizing from the very beginning of their education. One of the first courses they take in undergraduate nursing school is fundamentals in nursing, and we have an elderly LGBT plus patient you meet later that they interact with. So from the very beginning of education, this is not focused content, this is not specialized content, it is woven into the content throughout the curriculum. And this is also a safe space to learn and a safe space to make mistakes. This is a place where if they're interacting with Tanner, they make a mistake, they use the wrong pronoun, they ask an offensive question, we can give them feedback immediately. Tanner isn't hurt from it, and the patients that they interact with in the future are going to benefit from that learning moment. And they can also receive feedback on the ways in which their own therapeutic communication can be improved or refined correctly. So, I want to introduce you to our little LGBT plus family here at Shadow Health. These are all the characters that we have currently out on the market. And so I'll introduce those in just a second, but I do want to talk for a minute about the principles that are behind developing these characters. So the very first thing we strive for is respectful, meaningful, and accurate representation. We make decisions that are grounded in therapeutic communication and learning value. We aim to avoid stereotypes or model minority representation. And we utilize the power of self-identification. Our patients all have their own unique identities that they are happy to tell the learner about. And also healthy boundaries of conversation. There are going to be things that are inappropriate for a healthcare provider to ask. If you're coming in for back pain, there's no reason to talk about aspects of your identity. And so we have our patients hold those boundaries with our learners in some conversations. And we also bring in external consultants, which I think Nancy spoke to really powerfully. This is a way of protecting your own team. Bringing in external consultants takes the burden of being an internal or invisible consultant off of your own team members. And it's incredibly important in terms of creating a safe environment. When you have that outside perspective, that external consultant can tell you to do something or say something that somebody internally on the team may not feel safe to say or speak up about. So it's an incredibly important piece of representation. So these all inform our best practices during character development. We also have tools like a personality workshop, which if you've ever played a tabletop role-playing game or Dungeons & Dragons, it's sort of similar principles of who is this patient, how are they going to respond to this scenario, what are some things that are open or not open to talking about. Those are all kinds of things that we come together as a team and decide. We also have a learning consideration algorithm to determine what are appropriate uses of underrepresented demographics and populations, and what are inappropriate circumstances in which those populations might be utilized. So, just to introduce you to our characters, can I walk over here and show you guys? So, this is Michaela Henderson. I'm going to go right to left. Michaela Henderson in the orange skirt. Michaela is a 21-year-old college student. She's a bisexual woman. And she actually comes into her college university clinic with a UTI, something I'm sure many of us have experienced before. And in the case of this conversation with Michaela, you have to be able to ask her about her sexual history with partners of multiple genders. And then we have next Vivian and Jennifer Wu. They are co-mothers to their daughter Eden, who Jennifer is holding. And they appear in our pediatrics and our maternal health products. We have Isabella Fisher next to them. Isabella is our first elderly LGBT plus patient. She's a lesbian woman who's living in a long-term care facility, recovering from a stroke, and she's in our fundamentals product. We have Tanner Bailey, who you're going to hear a lot more about next. And then we have Felipe Barbosa, who is a firefighter. He's married to his husband Marvin. And so I'm just really proud seeing them all together. I just love this little group. I want to talk specifically about Tanner Bailey. And to our knowledge, Tanner was actually the first virtually simulated patient for a nursing simulation that uses a natural language processing algorithm. So Tanner hit the market December of 2017. And something that's kind of amazing is that our customers did not ask us to create a transgender patient. Instead, the American design team researched this possible case, we pitched it, and we advocated for it to leadership of Shadow Health at the time. Once that was approved, we also ended up recruiting a voice actor who is transgender and local to Gainesville, Florida, where Shadow Health's offices are based. We felt it was important to represent a trans patient in a scenario where their trans was not the focal point of the simulation. So Tanner is coming in advanced pharmacology with back pain, and that is what we discussed with Tanner. Tanner demonstrates strong boundaries, allowing learners to understand what is inappropriate or invasive to ask them given the context of the simulation. And Tanner's case highlights difficulties that trans people face on a daily basis. He experiences gender incongruences. He experiences employment and healthcare discrimination. He's lost jobs because of his identity. And he has strained relationships with some family members. At the same time, Tanner is very proud of his transition. He's very proud of himself. He has a support network of close friends and family, and he's incredibly proactive about his own health and happiness. He goes to the gym daily. He's the director of a local queer theater, and he's very happy to talk about the positive aspects of his life and the ways that he's proud of himself. We revisited Tanner's case earlier this year and created a sort of Tanner 2.0 for an undergraduate product that is called Community Health. This is a situation in which Tanner is coming in to get a referral to a new provider. The provider he'd been using to get his hormone replacement therapy had closed or had moved, so Tanner's coming in to try and get a better referral from the community health clinic. And to revisit Tanner's case, we partnered with a consulting firm called Equity Consulting. This helped us ensure that we were taking extra care because for the first time we were doing a physical assessment with Tanner. So Equity Consulting was amazing to work with. They helped us to build this incredible cutting-edge rapport building activity that we have, which I'll talk a little bit more about. But in this assignment, learners focus on building rapport, gaining consent from Tanner for the assessment, determining Tanner's needs, and creating a comfortable atmosphere. In the rapport building activity, learners navigate an initial conversation with Tanner, which many nursing students have reported they're uncomfortable having or they would not be prepared to have when they enter the workforce. So they introduce themselves, they introduce their own pronouns, and they ask Tanner's preferred pronouns and how Tanner would like to be referred to. They ask what would make Tanner comfortable during the physical exam. This is a head-to-toe assessment, which involves an exam of Tanner's chest. And so they ask Tanner, would you prefer a gown? Would you prefer a drape? What terms would you prefer that I use in referring to your anatomy? They ask about any additional patient needs or considerations that Tanner may have before they start the physical assessment. So yeah, just to wrap up on Tanner, I am so proud of the community health product. I think it is incredible. It's a way of teaching undergraduate students how to have conversations that they may have never had before or had the opportunity to practice. It's also teaching excellent assessment building skills. And I'm sure there are many of us who wish that a healthcare provider had given us a little bit more context and conversation before jumping into assessment. So what's ahead for Sabbagh Health and Elsevier? We are exploring additional representations of gender inclusivity, including a possible non-binary solution coming next year, which I'm very excited about. We're continuing to create content around the relationship between identity, social determinants of health, and barriers to care, which we feel are essential pieces of knowledge for healthcare providers to have before they enter the workforce. And our own internal processes are continuously improving and expanding. We've come so far in 5 years, and things have continued to grow. I love being able to come together and have challenging conversations with my team members. We're continuously updating our own documentation and workflows to work towards better representation of the products and expand our little Sabbagh Health universe. And if I was going to leave you with any piece of advice, it would be to hire brilliant people and listen to them, because your team will drive innovation. I showed you the sort of the first version of Tanner and then the version that came 4 years later for community health. But that version 2.0 came about because after launch, one of our biggest clients came to us and said, we want a transgender patient. And we said, great, we've got one. We've had one on the market for 5 years, actually. So you can drive innovation forward by listening to your team, listening to what they have in terms of ideas or gaps that they or needs that they may see the market that may not be aware of, and that's going to keep you ahead of the curve for years to come. Thank you all for your time. Thank you for the invitation, Teacher Gwen, and I'm happy to answer any questions about processes, team development, anything like that. But yeah, thank you all so much. Enjoy your conference.
Feel free to just shout out your questions. I think it's small enough in here that we can all hear each other as well. So feel free to ask any questions you might have of any of the three of us. Oh, go ahead.
So you mentioned that the local consortium has started to see positive reactions for the identity. I was just wondering if you could sort of elaborate on what the reaction was, how it changed relationship, the catalog, or, with the work that they do?
Well, the reactions they had are anecdotal, so they haven't like, now in retrospect. Oh, okay. I'm looking at the computer going, what are the Oscars, right? Thank you, and we're just talking now because we're being coached. So everything we have is anecdotal, but it's really been students interacting with library staff, like at the store desk, saying, I need help with a search, and then telling us in the end that not seeing the terms that they noticed there the prior semester was impactful to them, which, and I don't know, I wish we had done some sort of survey before we watched the change, but hindsight's 2020, right? Because it would be lovely to see how much impact it's having. And maybe I feel like that's something nice reflection. Maybe we could do it at an Ohiolink level, since it's a much broader audience to choose from. So, but yeah, it's the anecdotal stuff, and it impacts librarians, frankly, in a way that I hope the awareness is maybe leader.
Your approach is to think that the scope of DEI conversations or initiatives is not broad enough. It's sort of, potatoes not meat, so to speak. What's a good approach to that? I know it's kind of very general.
In my head, you're asking the wrong person because I'm super direct, so my approach would be to say, the scope of DEI at our organization is not broad enough. We are literally tackling this little part of the problem, and the problem is this big. So how can we take steps to approach the whole thing? And I know it's challenging. I know it's challenging because it involves a lot of conversation where people are uncomfortable. But also, we won't get anywhere if we don't really know about conversation. So maybe that's the point where you bring in a consultant or somebody else and say, let's do this kind of review of our efforts so far. And maybe if an outside source says, hey, you're doing great here, and now it's time to focus here, maybe the powers that be will be more receptive to it.
This is some big keywords.
Your catalog is shared with every consortium member, right? Oh, yes. Yep, the shared system. Yeah.
So Nancy, I have a question about, so Ohio made the decision to keep it for 2 terms.
Yep.
Do you know why?
I don't know why Ohio made the decision to keep the 2 terms. All I can tell you is that with Opal, they were like, that's not enough. And so they wanted to, so they worked to find a system. I know with Opal, the challenge was that if they didn't do something, every time they re-uploaded records from Ohiolink, that they would still, those terms would come back in. So they were like, let's find a solution so we don't have to manually go back every time to fix that. But I'm not sure. I wasn't privy to those systems.
Question about Portugal and what's going on there. Can you speak a little bit more to what national policy they have that is making such an impact?
That report just came out, so no. Yes, to me, when I had all that the gender, the researcher gender, if I had asked, a random sampling of people, like, what countries do you think are top? I'm sure they would have said Scandinavia, and then it's Argentina and Portugal, I think, was a big surprise. So I have not been able to read that report yet, but they just did a presentation. It was just rolled out at the national level. So yes, I'm looking forward to seeing what did they do. I'm sure, if I had to guess, it has to do with supporting work-life balance for women. You probably all know that the pandemic disproportionately affected women researchers, and that showed up right away. In fact, the World Economic Forum estimated that to get gender parity, it was going to take 99 years. It's now 135 years, so we've added 2 generations to an already horrific 5-generation sort of path forward, and that was just the pandemic.
That's depressing.
It is depressing. So that's, everyone's like, what did Portugal do?
Depressing, but also an opportunity, right? So if we know it's going to take 130 years, again, why
things about data, like the Scopus data, is that it can be sliced. It can, that was a country level focus, but it can be sliced down to individual institutions, so that if somebody was interested in that dimension for their institution and subject disciplines, that data is there. Obligatory product. This is a sponsored lunch. Obligatory product, placement. So, but yeah, that data is there.
Okay.
And I just want to mention that about the methodology for that was a really complex inferred gender identity using name sorts. So, but they're pretty confident in the methodology they use. So that was not, but it started thinking about that self-reported gender identity to get a much better data-driven look at that.
No problem. I have a question about the nursing product. How much input and/or feedback have you had from folks who are operating those spectrums into the product? Do you solicit feedback from different LGBTQ organizations, or do you have like an advisory committee that is made up of people who identify on that spectrum?
Yeah, great question. So trans equity consulting was a great help to us when developing Tanner Bailey in particular. And we also are, a data-driven product. So when we look at disparities or inequity, what we do is run sources that are published and talk about what are the social determinants of health and barriers to care based by different populations. And then we do also bring in cultural consultants for different aspects. For example, the elderly LGBT plus patient we developed. So those can be either on an iterative basis where we're meeting with them weekly to get feedback on the things that we've done. It can be synchronous where we send them content to review, like all the dialogue we're bringing in to get holistic feedback on that. Or playtesting is another option, having them actually play through the simulation. But yeah, we aim to bring in consultants at every level, from the concept phase through production.
And what kind of feedback have you gotten from nursing students?
That's a great question. You do get people who are like, you and your communist agenda,
Right.
That's
what I wanted to
But it's rare. That's very rare. And in fact, what our students find the most helpful are moments where we help them identify what are cultural considerations that are directly impacting what you need to do to tailor care to this patient. That's where they find the most helpful sort of content, or the things they respond to the most. Anecdotally, there was a study published earlier this year that was a survey of healthcare providers in Southern Appalachia, where I'm from, and I grew up in Johnson City, Tennessee. And in that survey, 9 out of 10 healthcare providers said, yes, I treat all my patients the same regardless of their identity, which is like, who's that 10th person? First of all, why are we getting them? Healthcare providers, are they the self-aware ones? Like, it's very hard to know. But within that, when we looked at the qualitative data, they said things like, I'm going to use the name that is on the patient's form, and not the name that they prefer. I'm going to refer to them using sex that's assigned on the form. I don't care how they consider themselves. And so you're facing those levels of microaggressions and bias that are unconscious for providers. More than half of LGBT plus people live in rural communities. So this isn't like a small case only designed for, this isn't limited to Southern Appalachia, basically. And so those are the kinds of things, like I think in the short term, they see immediate helpful feedback, and I can see this and I can take action on it. And I think in the long term, we're going to see benefits about better patient relationships, which ultimately leads to better patient outcomes.
I have more questions.
Yeah.
Sorry. We have a huge nursing program, so I'm very interested in something like this. And I'm also So, do you see, I know you said you're going to expand into like gender queer folks, non-binary gender queer folks. Do you see yourself expanding into pediatrics? Because a lot of people who are in the rainbow mafia are identifying at earlier and earlier stages. And that's where I see real resistance with medical care. When you're older, when you're in college or you're an adult or you're even a senior, you're much better at advocating for yourself in general. But when you are somebody who is 14, 15 years old and is, debating whether you're genderqueer or you're trans or you're just bisexual or you're pansexual or whatever it is, it would be great to have affirming medical staff there. So it would be really great if a product like this could actually also deal with, because everybody in that was an adult, except for the baby, but baby hasn't declared gender yet, so the baby.
Eve's still like sleeping, moving,
Right.
She's just a little up, yeah. I think that's it's a wonderful idea. I definitely think that, for pediatric patients, it's treated like specialized care when it should be part of primary care. And so it should be primary care providers feel comfortable to have those conversations with their patients. So in our undergraduate pediatrics product, we do have parents who are LGBT+, but who don't have children represented that way. But we also have more opportunities in the future, more assignments coming. So I think it's a great idea. I'd love to talk to you more about it.
Yeah, I have a question for you. Can you create a product like this, but for librarians? I mean, in my head, I was like, could we have reference interviews based on them? Because pretty much for every profession. Yeah, right. It's for everyone. Conversational practice. Yes. It would be amazing. I don't know how to do that, but.
Let's start right now. Right. I really believe in this technology. I think, communication and storytelling has been a thread of my whole life, and I think that most problems are communication problems, and I think that if we're teaching people to be better communicators in a professional setting, that's going to impact the rest of their lives positively, the lives of everyone they interact with. And I think for this technology, these guys are going to so I think we can do anything. I'm ready.
Right? Well, look at mine. Okay. Great questions. Other questions, comments? Yeah, go ahead.
Comment. I wonder, because education seems becoming so political, and in Texas, as you know, all of the new laws and whatever that are being created, that it's also, you get kind of fearful of what you say is going to be taken out of context, and there'll be repercussions from that. I wrote an article on critical race theory, and if you saw some of the feedback, that it was not a political article, it wasn't, didn't name anyone anything, but I was so surprised, but it made me think that, I'm not going to do another one, but, who knows what will happen. And even our president, who was very, Dr. Richardson, on the prairie, Dr. Richardson, who is everyone knows her, she's very well respected. She created this Race and Justice Center, and she hired new people to be in it. Nikki Giovanni, one of the leaders from the founders of Black Lives Matter, all these well-respected people. And she said that she didn't know that it was going to stay because of the political climate in Texas. So, this is just, we want to do things that are related to diversity, but it's that, that fear that something will happen if you do.
Right, but if we don't do it, what happens as well? Like I would put that question back to everybody else in this room. What can we do individually and collectively to make sure that when you get a negative response to a neutral article that is presenting back, that it's either heard or that the people who are doing that information sharing feel supported? And I don't have an answer, but I would love to know what y'all think about that. Because if you don't publish in that area, then the people who are opposed to your thoughts are winning, right? It just shuts down. If we all just decide we're not brave enough to do this, but also there are real consequences. So you do have to share them.
Well, I'll grab my next. You were originally saying how people of color are not PEI experts. And just a little bit of very personally, I think that there's understanding that there's a racism of ignorance that is everybody's own, you know. And I think that is to the part of the great period was made ignorant. And to me, I think that's the right way to say that. But yeah, I feel like there should be more accept that you want to be ignorant that you are making a choice. And I'm not sure that's what you said makes me think.
Well, and it makes me think about the whole diversity, equity, inclusion argument. Although in my mind, it's not really an argument, but it's look at nature. The greater diversity, biodiversity, right, means that we have a healthier system that we're living in. I think the same is true for people, but I don't know how you people who don't want to hear that to understand that it's their lives are better off if they're more accepting or. But I'm not. If I knew how to, reach that to the world, that makes sense. So, and I've been reading this interesting book, and one of the concepts that they talk about, that one of the things that makes it so hard to talk about race, I think, is that whiteness and white people are two different things, but when you talk about whiteness and the harm that that's had in our society, then unfortunately many white people think you're saying I'm a terrible person because of this, but they're not the same thing. So I don't even know, how do we start at the beginning and break that down and say, we're not talking about you individually, your family, or your grandfather. We're talking about collectively as a unit we've done these things, and collectively as a unit we have to solve it, but it also involves individual responsibility to make it happen.
Right. And maybe these Sabbagh.
I have not yet. I'm going to add that to my list.
Huh?
Oh, I said, do I need to add that to my list?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And Heather, you were saying?
Oh, I was going to say sometimes it also involves uncomfortable self-reflection. People do not like that.
Well, because it is uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And that happens for all, I mean, sure, everybody has that happen too. It's not just, don't get me started. I mean, in my community, there's a whole, in my family, I have 2 children. They are lovely. The 3 of us are all different shades. And from their dad's side of the family, who are people of color, they get comments about you're too white or you're too dark. So there's this whole internal, even within we do it to ourselves. Right. So that's a problem as well. Right. So it's multi-layered and complicated, but
I mean, it's like internalized misogyny, right?
yeah.
And something this makes me think of too is that, empathy is a skill. Like we think often that empathy is something you're born with or you don't have or do, and there are actually multiple kinds of empathy and they are all teachable and buildable. And I think that when we're running situations like she mentioned where there was sort of this self-protective ignorance, that's people lacking an empathy towards themselves or an empathy skill to be able to put themselves in other people's perspectives.
So I bet you could get empathy built into a curriculum even if you couldn't give CRT. Right? Maybe that's our first step, is we have an empathy curriculum and then the end result.
There's a lot of debate in nursing about empathy too. Talk about
The debate?
Yeah.
Really?
Yeah, like, so what level of empathy is necessary to be a good healthcare provider? Is there ruinous empathy in healthcare situations? Is there a level of empathy so extreme that it causes you not to be able to take action? There's Elsevier's great papers published.
I do want to mention that for us, there's always a literature. It starts with a literature.
Well, I play very on the team, so
I know,
Any other
questions, comments?
Enjoy the rest of your lovely in-person conference. I'm so thrilled to be here, but it's exhausting.
Well, and thank you for joining us. I feel like I want to end with like some sort of charge of like think of one thing you could do find some way while you're at the conference to show empathy for somebody who's not like you. Put it into practice.